you can't change what happened, but you can certainly change your understanding of it. Only 7% of communication is the words that come out of our mouth.
And it used to be sobriety was the measure. You know, if you're sober, you're successful. That gave me chills because I know a lot of sober people who don't feel like they're being very successful right now, spiritually, mentally, and emotionally.
That I have to come to terms with this might not turn out the way I want it to turn out. That's the grief.
Hey everybody, and welcome to another exciting and integrated episode of Finding Peaks. Yours truly, Chris Burns, president and founder. I am joined today by somebody who, dare I say, I revere in our field, Dr. Michael Barnes, PhD, licensed addiction counselor, licensed professional counselor, also founder of the Michael Barnes Family Institute, which we're going to get into here. As well, you sit on the board as the senior clinical advisor for the Foundry as well. Among other things, author, entrepreneur, father. Grateful to have you, Dr. Barnes.
Thanks so much. I'm just so happy to be here. I love doing these things. So, and I appreciate, everything you all are doing. And it's really nice to, it's really nice to do something with another treatment center. I always like that collaborative stuff. So,
yeah, it's really nice. I always like, as we were talking at the symposium earlier, we have the 50th annual Winter Symposium going on. We were just kind of checking in when the first one we went to and this kind of thing. And Dr. Barnes was, it was about 13, 14 years ago. You were looking at the pamphlet and saying, man, I got to be at this conference. And now you're a keynote speaker.
Yeah.
What has that been like to kind of that maturation process alongside kind of our Colorado provider group?
Well, to be quite honest, a lot of it was really luck, and a lot of it was really happenstance. And I've been very fortunate to be in the right place at the right time a lot of times. And I had been on the faculty at University of Colorado, Denver in the counseling program, ran into Steve Millett, who was my supervisor at Cedar, and asked him, who are you and what do you do? And next thing I know, I'm visiting over at Cedar. And the next thing I know, I'm the clinical director at Cedar, and it just sort of happens. And the state has changed a lot, but I love the energy. The conference was just such a fun time because you get to see all these old friends and people that you've worked with and over the years, and it doesn't have the same adversarial feel that some places has, and the competition of programs. So it's been really interesting to watch the growth of the clinical programming and the sophistication increase from pretty kind of simplistic clinical work to really being trauma informed and trauma integrated and culturally aware. And so I think it's that's the thing that's most gratifying, is to think maybe I had a little bit to do with that growth of the trauma integrated piece, and sort of brought a lot of that to the state when I came from Florida.
And maybe you have a lot to do with it. You have a very unique lens of which you saw our field through, I think, a little bit differently than the average clinician. And I hadn't known that until we checked in at the symposium, but maybe talk with the viewers a little bit about how you worked as a clinician within the hospital system and how you kind of viewed the recovery process and maybe how that changed or shifted a little bit as you came into behavioral health.
So where that story really starts, it's really interesting because I hadn't thought about it in a long time, is during COVID I found a box in my garage when I was cleaning it out that had all of these papers that I wrote back in the 1990s at Florida State. And I opened the box and there was a paper on top that said residential alcoholism treatment. Think how long ago it's been since you heard anyone say that.
It's very specific.
Is it time for a family systems paradigm shift? And I was being trained as a family traumatologist, a person who works with severely traumatized families and worked as a medical family therapist. So my PhD's as a family therapist, but I never really wanted to be in private practice. I always liked working in hospital systems. And so when I think about we tell clients all the time, we tell families all the time that addiction's a chronic, progressive, potentially fatal illness. But we don't really treat it like that. And so as someone who's worked in big hospitals, when I think of a chronic illness, I think of really a medical condition that is dealt with by a team of, just like we do. And but like what I did was I started reading as much as I could about diabetes. And I started reading as much as I could about like multiple sclerosis. And I really went back to say chronic disease management has a really different view of how families should be involved than addiction does. And addiction, so what I did was I went back and I looked at 10 websites of 10 of the best treatment centers in the country. And because I was getting ready to do a presentation and I wanted to talk about best practices, but not from a scholarly perspective, but what do my peers do? And it was all about, you need to heal so that you can support this person in their recovery. Well, that keeps that person in the identified patient role. And when I started reading about medical chronic illness, the research said that when families start to heal together, the person who has the chronic illness actually is much more likely to manage that illness successfully when they come out of the patient role and really get rejoined into the family as a healing entity. And so that's my view. And the idea of, you need to support your loved one is true. And so the mission statement of the Michael Barnes Family Institute is helping families move beyond we're a family that supports a loved one in their efforts to recovery to we are a family in recovery from addiction and trauma. And that really opens the door to we're all in this together. And so the research would say, if we're all in this together and we have an agreed upon belief that this illness didn't just impact Joe or Fred, it impacted me too, and it impacted all of us. So if we all work together, then that means we all heal. And if we begin to look at things like 12-step work and going to meetings, less as treatment and more as this is what people with chronic illnesses do. They manage their illness by doing healthy things for themselves. And so I think of how many families have said to me, when does this IOP end so that we can go back to normal? And it's like, whoa, come on, hold on a second. That normal ship sailed a long time ago. And so, and the last one that the research is really clear on is that person manages their illness better when other people in the family are willing to look at their own illness. And when they can have a conversation, not about, hey, how are you today and are you okay? But let me tell you, I'm really struggling today. I'm to where everyone has that opportunity to say, yeah, I've been pretty impacted by all this too.
Wow. And for some reason, the chronic issue of addiction hasn't been dealt with in that way. I remember it's actually bringing up for me when I saw you speak, almost 11 years ago now in Aspen at the Limelight. I think you were working for Cedar at the time. And I remember you were talking about this very thing you're talking about right now. And I remember thinking to myself, yeah, that doesn't work, Dr. Barnes. But this is amazing stuff out here on the ground level, only to sit with you today and be like, man, you were speaking some truth 11 years ago.
Well, we were talking today about that presentation I did with all the neuroscience. And it was like, it was so long ago. It was, 2013. And the looks on people's faces were like, well, what is this guy talking about? And now you can't go to any conference without multiple people talking about that. And I don't think, I think that's pretty cool, to be honest.
Really cool.
But I'm so grateful that we're at a point now where when you talk about neuroscience and you talk about memory systems and you talk about how that impacts the work that we do, that people aren't looking at me like I have 6 eyes. That it's like, oh yeah, we're trained in that now. And
it makes a lot of sense from that approach too, because when you kind of explained it from the medical side, with type 2 diabetes, mom might come home and dad would help her get the M&Ms and anything sweet out of here, We're not going to have the bread. We got this thing. Hey, we all did it together. We're in this fight. I can remember my grandma was diagnosed years ago. It was this thing. Everybody came in. We did a house cleaning together. We worked together to solve the problem. Oh, it gives me chills if I'm saying it. For some reason, for addiction, for so many years, we've said, it's Joey's problem. Let us know when you're better.
Yeah, we love you and we want to be with you, but it's really you have to prove to us that you're ready. And we were talking about lapse, and I said, we were talking about how do you talk about a lapse? And I said, well, I don't know. The answer really is, how do you talk about it so that it lasts for 3 days rather than 3 years?
Right.
And it's, how do you have a productive conversation about, look, we've all been trained. We understand lapse happens. How do you get back on, what do you need to do to get back on into your recovery program? I mean, you were doing great. How do we do that? As opposed to the rockets,
when you have 3 months.
The rockets blowing up, and the shame that happens. And usually families can grasp that idea of, it's a really different conversation. And I remember I had a mom say to me, well, I can't talk about relapse to my son. I said, why not? And she said, well, it'll make him think that I condone it. And I said, I don't think you have any role. You don't have any role in it. I said, it's like, that's his to decide. But the idea of, you can talk to him about what you're learning and how you're learning it and what that means to you, without, and it's not condoning it. And so that's the thing that's been missing.
Yeah.
And the reality is, if I ask my son or whomever 6 times in about 4 hours if he's okay, then what I'm saying to him is, I don't think you're okay. You know, a guy at UCLA, and I can't think of his name, did a study many years ago, and he said that only 7% of communication is the words that come out of our mouth. 93% is our nonverbals, our tone of voice, our facial expressions when we say it. And you know, you hear people having an argument and someone say, that's not what I said. And they say, well, but it kind of is what you said. You didn't say those words, but, and so that's a big part of what we're trying to do in our Family Institute, is teach people to remember that you can't not communicate. Or in family therapy, we say, what are you communicating when you don't think you're communicating? And that's what families, I think, get such change with when they realize they have to get really clear.
Yeah.
And
be relational. And that's one of those things, like we were talking about with kids earlier, is we've learned, like, yeah, actually being relational with kids in the developmental stages of life is really crucial. We didn't know that. But for some reason, when people with addiction issues or substance-related disorders check in, all of a sudden, we're not relational. It's like, here's the RX, here's the plan, let us know when you've checked the boxes. It's not like, how do you feel? To your point, a lapse? Gosh, I bet you're having some shame come up, man. That probably sucks. Wow, yeah, it does suck, Dad. Like, I know, man, I'm here with you. You know, how do we get back on path together? Maybe, you know, I just love that. And you can see those, again, back to like the people feeling safe with the people that they should feel safe with. Is so valuable.
Yeah, it's, I think families get such a bad rap in many environments. And you know, I hear people saying, well, I just brought you the healthiest member of this family. And when they drop a client off, and you know, I've been a family therapist for 30 years, and I remember I had a student that said, what's the best way to work with an unmotivated client? And I said, I don't know, I've never worked with an unmotivated client. And the whole room started laughing, and I said, well, you know, all of my people that I work with are pretty highly traumatized, and that they're highly motivated to stay as safe as possible. And that sometimes that safety keeps them stuck in the same patterns. And it's my job to address that with them rather than to write them off. And and I said to the students, if you think your clients don't know that you've written them off, you're kidding yourself.
Trauma resilient, not treatment resistant.
Right.
Yeah. Madeline Padilla, she's one of our admissions people. That's her thing. Yeah. So she gets on the phone and they're like, I'm treatment resistant. You're trauma resilient. Trying to stay safe. We get it. But you just spoke to that so eloquently, and that's the truth.
Yeah, it is the truth. And think, what's the first thing we do with a client who's in a pre-contemplative state? We use motivational interviewing, and we don't give up, and we keep talking, and we keep, asking those questions and two-sided reflections. And but with families, we tend to say, well, they just don't want it. They're not ready. And there's some research out there on motivational interviewing with families with addiction that's pretty promising.
Yeah, and you talked earlier too about the kind of, I know Lisa Smith talks about this too with Reclaim Recovery, but kind of like a parallel recovery a lot of times, and specifically at the Michael Barnes Institute, but as well as the Foundry, how you guys do family programming. Maybe talk a little bit about how the families are kind of running through somewhat of a similar process to the individual. How does that work?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So if you think about what I just said about family recovery rather than family support, that, how do you make a decision that you need to recover? Well, you have to come to terms with, you have a problem. And so much of what we're really doing is educate. So in our program, it's educating in really general ways until the family can say to us, I have all of that. And it's like, yeah. That idea of, well, it's not my problem, it's his problem. Or, well, I don't know why I'm the one that needs to change. I mean, if he would just change and go back, we could go back to normal and all of those things. But once that family begins to decide on their own, well, yeah, that's really interesting. That's fast. And they think they're reading all of that stuff about their loved one to help their loved one, and then they realize, holy cow. So the parallel process is, do I have a problem? Do I have the problem that they think I have? Families go through the exact same thing. Why are they telling me I need to do this? I'm just here to support him. I love him. Right. Am I powerless? Do I have powerlessness? And so what do traumatized clients use as a way to try to assume some power? Hypervigilance and control. The cornerstones of the trauma survivor. And it's the same hypervigilance and control that clients use in order to keep their addiction going. But it's different, but it's a similar process. And so, do I really need to go to those meetings? Just like clients will say, well, I want to get sober, but I don't think I need to go to all those meetings. Families say the same thing, and it's like, well, I'm not going to Al-Anon. And then eventually they begin to realize, I'm getting a lot out of this group with these other families. Maybe when someone brings up Al-Anon and says, I went to the best Al-Anon meeting the other day. And someone says, well,
these people are really great. They're just like me.
Yeah, it's like, well, where is it? And suddenly, now they're going to that meeting. And so I think sometimes we expect too much too fast. And, think about it. How often do you try to solve a problem that you don't think you have?
Oh, yeah.
Well, and how often do you take recommendations that you think don't match the problem that you're trying to get out?
In one ear and out the other. Yeah.
And so that's really kind of where I'm at with that is, and we've talked about it earlier, that families will say, well, what do you think we should do? And I've learned that if I just tell them that there's a natural defensiveness or something, and I say, well, that's a great question. Let's talk about, what have you tried? And so don't, not getting into that, but much more, wow, let's collaborate. Look at what you've done, and then think, well, maybe there are some things that we can come up with. But I can't tell you.
I love that approach. It's very present. It requires kind of being where your feet are and, meeting that family system where they're at. I guess one of my questions for you, Dr. Barnes, are you seeing, because as you're talking, I'm starting to feel it, and I see it in our program a bit. Are you seeing that parents, especially of the population we were talking about, young adults, are you finding that they, grief week's a real big thing for folks in treatment sometimes. They go through grief, they grieve, necessary. Are you finding that families, parents, need to go through an authentic grieving process?
Absolutely.
Right?
It's interesting. I did a research project several years ago when I lived in Florida in my previous life. And one of the questions that we asked them to talk about what life is like as a parent and as a family member. And one of the things that came out clearly was trauma was a big piece of it. So in the study, I asked them, what's the number one because of your trauma associated with your loved one's addiction. And, you'd think emergency room visits and, getting arrested. And they said the shattering of dreams, that I have to come to terms with this might not turn out the way I want it to turn out. That's the grief. And they don't want, who wants to grieve? I don't want to grieve. But that idea of, that's part of that parallel process is, am I gonna be open to the reality of what I'm really facing and allow myself to work through it? And so I think that grief piece is not addressed probably as well as it could be in treatment. I think it should probably be a bigger thing. And the fact that you're noticing it, and I'm certainly noticing it too, I think more of us are starting to see it.
Yeah.
And the other thing that's so interesting is with insurance, they've sort of done away with experiential therapy. And you've experienced it, I've experienced it, I've had great experiences with it. And most of our clients will never see it unless they get sober for several years and then go back.
Yeah.
Or
get to do something fun they pay out of pocket for.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
But 43 years ago when I started in the field, that's all we did was experiential work and gestalt work, and individual therapy was a minimal part of what we did. It was all group process, and I think that helps the grieving it helps the grieving process when you're being sort of supported in that experiential piece. And I'm a big advocate of telehealth, because it's hard to get to Steamboat if you're a family member. Half the year you can't get there half the time.
Or half those people would never walk in the front door in the first place, so they have this safety piece. They're in their own home, which is really nice. And I used to in the beginning because I was just such, I used to throw a lot of shade at it, but now that I've had the opportunity to zoom out, I think telehealth is extraordinary.
That was my presentation at the conference this year. So I did a study at Cedar where I started noticing something, and we had a great family program. It was literally known as one of the best in the country.
It was renowned.
And every Tuesday in that, I would come in and do the trauma lecture and talk to the families. And I started noticing that it wasn't the demographic that I expected it to be. And so we did a study where January 1, 2017, we did pre and post with every family member. And it turned out exactly how I thought it would turn out. The average person was between the ages of 55 and 65, female, mother of the client.
Okay.
Who wasn't there? The wife of the client, the partner of the client.
It was just mom. Yeah.
Just moms. Wow. And occasionally a dad, occasionally a partner.
Dad had to work, right?
Yeah, but and so I started to really think, and now that I have an institute and I'm out talking to people about it, that people will very quickly say, oh, no, we have an in-person program. And I say, well, that's great. I mean, it is the gold standard. I mean, but what if I can't get there? It's not the gold standard for me if I can't get there. And it could be the best program in the world. And so that's when I really started to look at technology as a way to make family services available to everyone.
You'll be happy to learn. I mean, it was a pandemic thing, and it was a cause of the pandemic, but now we stick with it. Our whole family program is virtual.
Yeah.
This whole virtual platform, Pema White does an extraordinary job, and she prefers it that way. We got people all over the country.
Oh, and that's the beauty of it is, think of the relationships that are being built. And like ours, you can do it on your phone, you can do it wherever you are. And so I think we're finally beginning to realize that I once had a supervisor that says, I don't care how you always did it. Like, it's not working. Yeah. We have to change it. And I think that's one of the things that I'm seeing is that, everyone complains about, like, high-speed internet is everywhere now. That, it's pretty reliable. Like, we can do these things. And so, and the research is really pretty clear that there are certain things that online can do better, and there's certain things that in-person can do better. But if you put them together side by side, they're pretty comparable. And so I think, I know it's not possible, but it would be nice if every family that couldn't travel to a family program got to have a virtual program like yours as well, or a virtual program like ours. And, and some places do that and some don't. But, it's a philosophy that they get to decide.
Yeah, I like the way that you approach that. I love the way you approach family systems and really honor the process that is like the family recovery, and it gets left out so often. And I'm sure we've talked about it before the show. I've seen it in my career, but I assume the recovery outcomes have to be double, if not triple, if not quadruple, when the family involves themselves within the process that their loved one's in. And I'm sure you have data to support that too.
Yeah, it's really true that there's not a lot of good data. And the hardest, someone once asked me, what's your success rate? There was someone in the field and I knew I could goof with them a little bit. Yeah. And I said, 100%. and they said, oh, stop. And I said, well, the only people who ever return our calls are people who are doing well. And the people who aren't doing well don't return our calls, so 100% of our clients are doing well.
Yeah.
And I said, no, like the problem is we have to find out how to do the data collection better. And you know who's not afraid to tell you if their loved one's not doing well? Families.
All the time. Yeah.
And so that was one of my thoughts as I started looking at allowing our families to come forever into our groups, that when someone's relapsed, that we notice their family shows up at group again, and we can begin to look at, how often is that happening? How often are people coming back to get that support again? And the newbies in the group are, oh my gosh, a relapse, but it's really powerful and it's really helpful. Just like if our OGs, the people who've been around forever, and they come in and say, "Well, he just had 4 years of sobriety," and to be able to celebrate that, but also to realize when we talk about lapse, we're not being negative.
Right.
We're being honest.
That actually doesn't quantify lack of success whatsoever.
Well, and that's another one of those things in chronic disease management. It's like people with diabetes relapse way more than people with addiction. And it's like, it's where we are right now. And you get back on the process that you're using to, manage your blood sugar, and let's try to keep it as short as possible so we don't have other medical concerns. But that's where that medical piece comes in handy. Let's not shame anybody, but it is hard.
Yeah, you make a really good point on that data, because the viewers might be thinking, well, you've been doing the AA thing since 1935. Where's your stats? To that point, it used to be sobriety was the measure. If you're sober, you're successful. That gave me chills, because I know a lot of sober people who don't feel like they're being very successful right now, spiritually, mentally, and emotionally. And so I don't think days in sobriety, although it can quantify or inform mental health, I don't think it equals success.
I agree with you, and I think that insurance companies and people are looking for that. Well, so where's the guarantee?
Right.
And I don't know why our chronic disease is all that different to them than all the other chronic diseases they pay for. Like you'd think that on some level there would be a level playing field with it's a chronic illness and people are going to lapse and need ongoing treatment, and just like a person who has diabetes and needs to have a surgery or because they didn't manage it, but it's not like they say you don't get that surgery.
Right. Yeah, or like don't come back until you've done certain thing for X amount of days and then we can talk. It's like, let me love on you. Yeah. Let me walk you through this. And some of these chronic issues are avoidable, similar to addiction, but life's hard sometimes. All of this stuff, to talk about parents' grief, is backed by the American dream. Gabor Mate spoke to this just so beautifully in The Myth of Normal. It's like, I had to get up on, and I say this all the time, but I had to get up on Pikes Peak to get the pot of gold that my family never had, to realize there's nobody up here.
Yeah.
And it's like the age-old journey that a lot of people that suffer with trauma think that they're going to get to this pinnacle that's on our TVs, it's in our newspapers, it's on our websites, and we get there. And not that you can't have both and, but the old adage that it's lonely at the top can be really, really experienced because we sprint to the mountaintop and we forget what matters along the way.
One of the big differences between chronic disease management in the medical environment and for us is that we still see recovery as a destination. And they don't. They see recovery as a process. And to them, recovery is this very jagged line of ups and downs and doing well, doing bad, doing well, doing bad. And then eventually it starts gradually going up and plateaus, and the person is managing their illness pretty well. But for us, like you said, sobriety is the deciding factor. And so you're only in recovery when you never go back, or when you're really that sober person.
Yeah.
But that's not how others view it.
You've probably heard, Dr. Barnes, where you get into recovery and they go, you're either going towards recovery or away from it. Oh man, I'm having a bad day. I'm going south here.
Yeah.
Yeah. But no, man. But you may have some remission with your diabetes. You may not. A new season may come, may spark something. That's a really good point.
Well, and think about what we were talking about earlier about young adults and like brain development and they don't go through developmental stages because of the drug use. Well, that person's not going to benefit from rehabilitation. They're going to benefit from habilitation. Like, they still have things that like rehab implies that you've already gone through all of that. You have a healthy sense of self. You've learned to cope. Your brain is developed.
You're ready for it.
We're just going to bring you back. And for the young guys that I work with, and you've worked with, getting sober is the scariest part because they don't know how to do anything. Like, they haven't gone through those. And so for that person to see recovery as a destination, it's going to take a while maybe for that person to get to a point where they really believe everything and they really understand everything, and the brain development has a chance to happen and to kind of work through, they go to sober living and positive things that I think the recovery as a destination for that person could be a real killer.
Yeah.
To be honest.
Really can be. And I experienced that a lot in the early stages of peaks. Those were like this end point. And when they got to it, it wasn't the room they thought they'd be in. And the shame catapulted, right? And if there's, I don't know, at least in my experiences, 16 years of doing this, I don't know that there's anything more synonymous with addiction than shame. And so what can we do today, Dr. Barnes, to meet people where they're at in an effort to just remove the shame, or at least dismantle it, or to your point, as we've talked, counterbalance it?
I think about shame a lot, and it's one of the things that I love about 12-step work is that I think it's really the best place to heal shame, to be honest.
I agree.
When someone comes into a room and says something that they did in their addiction, and everyone in the room looks at each other and goes,
Right on, Timmy.
Yeah, I remember that. And so that idea of I am with my, and so I was reading a book. It was written in '95. It was written by William White, and it's called Pathways. And he talks about tribes. And he said that when we think of culture, and culture being these overriding rights and wrongs, goods and bads, meaning belief systems and philosophies of life. And then we talk about the culture of addiction and how it really is a culture, but it's a culture that's intended to support active addiction. Well, White takes it down to an even smaller figure of people that he calls tribes. And tribes are the people who use the same drug as you. And he said, if someone is going to hang around with a group of people for 20 years in active addiction, they're getting something out of that. And that so often when they come into treatment, the treatment environment is so negative about nothing good ever happens with the addiction, is that it's not true for that person. I got my affiliation with that person. I got my friendships with that person. Now I'll use while you sit with the Narcan in case I overdose, and there is fellowship in that.
Yeah.
And White said that if we cannot convince a client convincingly that they can get the same things in recovery that they got out of that group, that lifelong recovery is impossible. And that's where I think the shame piece is to be able to hear that and to say, what did you get out of that? Instead of always, and we certainly have to talk about the consequences and the bad things that have happened, but if we're going to join with them and help them to be able to talk about things without shame, then we have to be really curious with them. And it's like, wow, that's really interesting.
Gosh, it's a cutting edge.
Can you get that maybe in a meeting? Yeah. I want you to pay attention to some of the guys in here, or maybe some of the staff that you know are in recovery, and begin to look at maybe some of the things that they have. And how do you get that here? But if we don't address that, then the shame isn't going to go away.
I love what you said there, because I remember going up to speak in my first meeting, and they were like, you're going to tell your story for an hour. I was 12 months and a day sober. And they're like, stay out of the problem, get into the solution. But I kept thinking the problem was the solution the whole time. I'm like, I want to talk about this. It feels very heavy and loaded. But these were my people. This was my community. This is where I was, fortunately or unfortunately, seen, valued, and heard.
Yeah.
There's something to this. I think it dovetails into kind of something that I certainly wanted to chat with you about before we get done with. When our solutions turn into problems. Your book, author. When did you publish? When was that published?
It was published at the end of 2023.
Okay. Pretty recent, but it's so telling. Maybe we can kind of climb into that a little bit, because I remember being in 5th grade, and I remember my right leg tapped something fierce. And I was the middle child, and I couldn't sit still. I couldn't keep my hands off of people. And they would ask me a silly question like, what's wrong with you? And I didn't know, so I gave you a terrible answer. But then in 6th grade, I took my first drink. I was hanging out with some guys that were older than me. And right away, my right leg stopped shaking. A community that I was fearful of, I was almost thrusted into the middle of. And I felt seen, valued, and heard in that moment. And so it was really difficult for me to not take that drink in 7th grade, and 8th grade, and 10th grade, and 12th grade, and college. And it began to kill me. But there was a moment in my life where if I didn't have it, I don't know where I would be. How does that happen?
Well, I mean, like transgenerational traumas and you know, the passing of addiction from one generation to the next, and all of those things. You know, I think our understanding of family dynamics are way more kind of informed than they were at any time, and I think the role of trauma plays into that. So I think there's you know, Paul Early, who's a fellow in the American Society of Addiction Medicine, says there are 3 ways that people become addicted. They either have a genetic predisposition or the epigenetic factors of that.
Something changes.
Yeah, something changes associated with the DNA. And or you're self-medicating, or you're in an environment where that's all you know. It is so normal. And I think about that, the idea that what I don't get in my family, I'm going to seek out. And my family had generational addiction, lots of trauma that I didn't know what trauma was. I just thought things were, like every family was like that. And so I think that's, so one of the things I was talking to today, I was teaching a class today, that we were talking about when you start using at 11 or 12, you not only get the relief, but it sort of, you organize your life around it.
Yeah.
And getting it, you know, procuring it, using it, being with your friends. You probably go through multiple friend sets until you finally get the one that really uses the way you want to use.
My people, yeah.
And, you know, you lose those childhood friends, the neighborhood kids that aren't going to do what you're going to do. Yeah. And I just think there's, you know, we always want to get to that factor of why does that happen? And because something's missing. Mm-hmm. You know, the somatic psychotherapists look at attachment as not just relationship, but when a child cries, they're in distress. They're needing someone to come and help them regulate. And so the somatic folks think what attachment really is as a child in dysregulation being regulated by a parent who is regulating their own autonomic nervous system. And so some of us didn't grow up with that. My mom didn't know how to do that. She loved us dearly and did everything she could, but no one ever helped her regulate.
Right.
And so, I think it's case by case, and it's part of each client's story, how they got to that.
Yeah.
And I think it's easy for me because to me, everything's a trauma.
It's clear.
Yeah,
Yeah.
not to make that happen. So it's interesting. If I'm at the Foundry, and we have a client, 25 years old, and I've looked at his career as a user, short as it probably was, and I see that they're kind of a failure to succeed. It's always been a struggle academically, and they may have been good at sports, but there were other issues.
Yeah.
I'll always ask them, so what's the big secret in your family? What happened in your family that got you here? And they'll say, I don't know what you're talking about. I'll say, come on.
Wow.
No one gets here without something. And then we find out from the family program that his brother died in a car accident when he was 12, and mom went into a severe depression after the accident, and his drinking started 2 months after the accident. And then, there's just always something. And so the trick in that, to me, is how to bring the family into that discussion without blame.
Right, without shame, too. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's how do I insert you into this and you're a part of it without pointing fingers? And that's an interesting transition. How do you find is the best way to walk with families into that process? Because we talked earlier about, sitting with clients and, hey, what do you need me to do? Well, that's yet to be explored. So how do you approach that with families? I'm sure you don't give them the to-do list and say, hey, get done with 1 through 5 and we'll see you before next group.
Well, the way we've designed the app is to start with their strength. And their strength is that they love their family member and they want to learn everything they can learn to help that person. Remember, they're being brought into a culture that they think that the goal is to support their loved one. Well, we're going to shift that with them in time. But that idea of, well, let's teach you what you want to know. What is addiction? How does it work? What's powerless? Is it really an illness? Those kinds of things. And then the next module is going to be on trauma. And by the end of that module, the families start to say, well, I have all of that.
My dad, my mom, yeah.
And once that shift begins to happen, the next module is on family trauma and how addiction traumatizes family systems, whether it's granddad's addiction, whether it's dad's addiction, whether it's son's addiction, whether it's husband's addiction, whatever. So we call it like developmental learning. We don't have those, they're always getting the discussion of, it's a family issue, it's a family recovery, but I don't expect them to jump into just, I'll do anything.
Right.
They say that sometimes, but that's aspirational in most cases. We did a study at Florida State where we assessed families with addiction who were brand new to the process.
First treatment or what have you.
First time. And then we studied families who had long-standing multiple. And what we found is that they both wanted different therapists, completely different. This person got frustrated if we tried to be too collaborative with them. Look, we don't know we're here to learn. Like coaching is really what they want. They want somebody to say, here's the things, here's what we're going to do.
Here's a game plan.
Yeah. And if you get too collaborative, it's like, if we had those answers, we wouldn't be sitting here with you. But the people who have been through the process a lot of times just couldn't tolerate a hierarchical therapist. And the idea that we think we're the expert because we have a degree doesn't fly. They're the expert because they've been through it for so long and they understand. And that they want a collaborative therapist, one who's going to listen Well, that discussion of what have you tried, rather than you need to do these things. That works with this one. That doesn't work with this one.
Yeah.
And so I think sometimes our family programs are too programmed, and they're not really able to adjust to the needs of what a family. It's kind of like, no. You need to learn these things, and we're gonna do that. And so we've tried to create a system that has both therapists and coaches. Some people need coaches, and some people need therapists. And as they're working through the process, that we're able to sort of meet them a little easier where they are. And the other thing is not expecting them to just jump into the system. Like they have to be ready to do that.
Yeah, because that can feel inauthentic too when they don't, and then you're like, hey, you didn't do the homework. But as you're talking, I'm starting to kind of like zoom out of what I've done for the last 16 years and just kind of come over to the family corner and to see that some of those folks might be coming in with more shame than their loved ones.
Oh my gosh, yes.
Especially with what we got, talking about the American dream and what we have on our TVs and what you're supposed to be as, someone in this United States of America today. The shame for them, and so ensuring that you're allowing them to walk into a seamlessly safe process to not catapult that shame is something that I don't think we've thought about as providers enough.
Well, and how many of those family members grew up in families where there was addiction and said, I'm never going to talk to my kids that way. And I'm going to love my kid, and I'm not going to be mad at them if they have problems. Yeah. And then over the course of time, and so it's interesting, like think of compassion fatigue that we think of as therapists, burnout and secondary trauma. When that term was first identified, it was identified at UCLA. I was at Florida State. We were working on secondary trauma, and the person who identified the term compassion fatigue wrote a letter to my supervisor and said, wow, it sounds like we're talking about the same thing. You're talking about secondary trauma, and we're talking about burnout. And when we first started, and I remember seeing the letter, and I remember Dr. Figley, who was my mentor, saying, what do you think of the name compassion fatigue? I said, I think it beats the hell out of secondary trauma.
Yeah, it's so much better. Wow.
I said, I'd rather believe I have compassion fatigue than that I'm just being traumatized. And but my point of that is we thought it was really about families of addicted families where compassion fatigue was. That there's two functions happening. One is we have to figure this out. And that we're going to spend so we talk about an 80-20 rule. That what we find is the families spend 80% of their time on one family member and 20% on other family members.
Yeah.
And they have the exact same trauma symptoms as someone with PTSD. They have hypervigilance, they have control, they have intrusive thoughts, they don't sleep, they're dysregulated. And we do collect data on the symptoms that families bring in. Wow. And it's pretty compelling to look at. They are as traumatized as could be. Yeah. And so
they're dysfunctional as can be.
Yeah. and that idea of so why I called the book When the Solution Becomes the Problem, that's a term we've used in family therapy for a long time, because it basically says that families do the best they can. And it's based on how they understand the problem and what resources they have available to them. And as therapists, some of our job, we think, is to give them resources. And then they don't use them, and we get upset when the resources that we give them don't match their understanding of the problem. And I wouldn't use resources that I didn't think matched. And so that idea of spending more time on the understanding. There's a famous quote about it that says, the problem isn't the problem is the family's constraining the problem. Because we have a problem,
sure,
but it's our understanding of it that gives us the ideas of what we should do about it. And so that's why when I say we start with educating, not expecting a lot of change until the person begins to say, wow, I think I'm seeing this differently. Wow, that's the change that we're talking about.
That's huge. It actually reminds me of my mother and I's relationship. You know, for years, when I grew up, my mother was addicted. But what I should have said all these years was my mother struggled with severe depression, of which sometimes she engaged with substances to get out of the chair, turn the lights on, do the things that normal people do. Yeah. How did I learn that? Last year. I've been in recovery a long time, and especially for a 39-year-old. And I had my mom out last year, and she was visiting the boys. She's a great grandmother. And I was talking to her about substances, and she said, yeah, I've just been depressed my whole life. I'm 38 years old. Mom, I never knew you were depressed. Oh, yeah. That makes a lot of sense. Makes a tremendous amount of sense, because the world told me that you were this thing, and then I believed it, and I said those things too. And it couldn't be further from the truth. I'm grateful to be able to see my mom in that way today, because it invites so much compassion.
I was teaching a doctoral class, and I said, I'm going to ask you a simple question. Can you change the past? And every single person in the room said, no, the past happened. And so when we think about perception of problems, we also tell a story about the past that has some truth and some not truth. And they looked at me and they said, well, clearly you disagree with us. I said, clearly I disagree with you. And I said, you know, if we can begin to understand the circumstances of the story that we tell, and I had an experience with my mom that was very similar to what you had. And I began to realize just how traumatized she was. And I had compassion for her. And the anger that I had for a lot of the things that had happened when we were kids, and the conflicts and stuff. And it was, you can't change what happened, but you can certainly change your understanding of it. And it's really different if my belief is that my mom was really mean, as opposed to my mom was really like traumatized. And so if we can change the story, we can change our response to the past. And I was watching a therapist who was a Vietnam vet doing therapy with a Vietnam vet. And I'm sitting behind the mirror watching it. And it was one of those guys that was a really angry vet, and really blamed himself and drank himself almost to death. And the other guy started doing EMDR with him. And all of a sudden the guy came out of the EMDR and he said, I was only 17 years old when I went to Vietnam. And the other guy says, yeah, so was I. And he said, any 17-year-old would have done what I did.
I was a kid.
And it's like, thank you, yes. Jesus, thank you.
Yeah.
That's exactly.
Junior, senior in high school?
That's what and he said, I guess I've been pretty hard on myself. Now, they had done multiple, it wasn't just like one session did it.
Yeah.
But I was watching and I just thought, that's where change happens. Yeah. So when the solution becomes the problem, is that when the problem is understood differently, it opens the door for new solutions.
And there's so much reparation and healing in that.
Absolutely.
Of the past. Can we change it? No, but can we begin to inform it differently and heal from it in a present way? And to your point, I love that you said that, because it's something that my mom she would be able to articulate if I asked her, but I haven't asked her, but she just shows it in community and in connection with me, that she's seen today, and she's valued, and she's heard, and you can tell sitting with her, there's nothing else in this world that matters. I mean, it's like we got grandkids, we got some food on the table, I got my son who sees me. This is heaven. And I'm so grateful to have such extraordinary humans and professionals around me, like yourself, like a lot of the people we have in our field, like a lot of people we have in this Colorado provider community that is tight-knit and connected. I love being able to sit in front of you and just ask you questions and learn about how we can move into this process together one day at a time.
Yeah, I think it's awesome, and I think this is how we change the world.
I love that. People, I always tell guys, even in early recovery, I'm like, you ready to change the world? Because you're already doing it. It's a beautiful thing, and the purpose-driven lifestyle that this recovery process can give people can really set folks up on a trajectory of success that is absolutely stunning and beautiful to watch. And so I really, really appreciate Dr. Barnes. I mean, just having you on the show, being able to sit with you an hour before our viewers are all the better. Through just hearing you explain things in just a really valuable and, to my point earlier, an authentic way. So people can hear them, taste them, smell them, integrate them. It's really been a privilege. Dr. Barnes, before we go, your website, just for the viewers, make sure they can find you on there, your book, as well as the Foundry's website. 3 things.
So my website is www.drmikebarnes.com.
Okay.
And
Mike, not Michael.
Mike.
Cool.
I was Michael when I was in trouble, so
That's my middle name.
I always did.
Christopher Michael.
I always do Mike. So the Foundry website is www.nrt, next right thing, behavioral health, and it's nrtbh.com. And it has all of our programs, the new program in Broomfield. We're opening some new IOPs that are going to be downtown again, like where we used to be.
Cool.
And so just so many good things happening, and there's a lot of good treatment in Colorado these days. So really happy to be a part of it.
Yeah, so grateful for you, Dr. Barnes, and Ben Court, the founder up there, and what he does for the community. You know, when I look at something like NRT, I think that's got an integrous backbone. Mm-hmm. And I know how Ben stands on that, and you all stand on it. You do what you say and say what you mean, and I think that just matters so much more than actually what we're doing, the why that you speak so clearly. Thank you so much, Dr. Barnes.
And I appreciate it. Like, it's really nice to hear that, and I do really appreciate it. And we've talked about it. I've been really lucky to fall into the right places, and so I'm pretty grateful about the career that I've had.
You and I both, Dr. Barnes. Appreciate you so much. Until next time, everybody, please check us out on Spotify, Instagram, anywhere you get your podcasts. You can watch past, previous episodes. This one will be out in no time. Until next time, peace. That was awesome.